Hello, this is your host Todd Lewis with Praise of Folly Podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Telegram, and Facebook. You can support me on Subscribestar, buy me a coffee and locals, and also don't forget to check out my Substack. So this is going to be the last official episode of the year. I may or may not have a end of the year roundup video. It sort of depends on, I guess, how many people are interested in joining. But this one is going to be a bit of a banger. So it's called Towards a Mental Science, a Proof of Concept. We've all seen media or read in fiction about, for lack of a better word, psychics. The idea is that a man with sufficient mental power can influence the world around him and other individuals. In cinema, we have Tetsuo from Akira, also in the manga. In video games, we have Red Alert 2 with Yuri, and the granddaddy of them all in novel form, the Foundation series with Isaac Asimov. In some sense, we have seen culture moving in this direction for some time. The meta context here is that the metaphysical view of science as a mechanistic and materialistic controlled system is falling apart. Anyone who's heard me reading Russell knows that even in his own day it was falling apart. I was like 1931. Due to the rise of variables and data that cannot easily be integrated into the model. When a measurement for any given value of natural phenomena is given, it is not the actual number. For example, it's not that everybody all measured that number. When a measurement, a spread of numbers from multiple measurements are used, then the numbers are compared and either an average is taken or plotted along some line or curve with wide-ranging outliers thrown out from the analysis. Possibly the scientist might also look at which method of measurement is most reliable and prioritize that in order to get the final value. It turns out that all the outliers that have been thrown away do not go away. They begin to form a shadow model that progresses with the observed and scientifically accepted model. This is the mechanism by which the purely materialistic science is crumbling. What is the shadow model and what will replace material science? And two words, mental science. And mental science will not deny the real value of physical science in the older material form. Science of that nature can be rooted in observation in two senses. Observing natural phenomena, such as a naturalist might observe birds. And observation in a controlled laboratory setting with test and control experiments. Mental science will not reject this, but instead of quote, observing unquote phenomena using the eye, the sense of mind and heart, or their union in thinking and feeling, will be the unit of perception. If we view alchemy as a sort of primitive psychology and mental science rather than an effort at primitive chemistry with turning lead into gold, which it of course was, in one sense, we can see that the goal of the Philosopher's Stone is the union of reason and emotion. The geometric expression for the Philosopher's Stone is a circle that contains a triangle that contains a square that contains a circle. The inner circle represents this union. If alchemy as primitive chemistry gave rise to the modern science, alchemy as primitive psychology can give us the starting point for a mental science. With regards to the mind itself, and for lack of a better word, space or region in which it exists, I have gone into more rigorous detail in my video entitled Philosophical Foundations for Rational Thought. For our purposes tonight, we will begin with the conclusions of that video. What is mind? Mind is a non-material substance. Mind is indubitable, unable to be doubted, invisible, unable to be divided, and incorrigible. Mental phenomena are private. Descartes showed us that the mind cannot be doubted or divided, and modern philosophical additions have shown that while the brain states can be observed via specialized instruments handled by specialized observers, mental states are not like this, at least with regards to external material reality. Using the Kantian insight of a transcendental argument, which can be expressed abstractly, if X exists or is true, then some Y must also exist or be true to account for the existence and intelligibility of X. As an example, Kant argues that if we accept geometry as real, we must also suppose space is real, as a precondition for geometry to be intelligible, since, of course, geometry in part deals with spatial realities. Therefore, there must be some higher plane of existence for the mind to exist in, given that the mind is itself not reducible or identical to the body, which again, I've demonstrated that more rigorously elsewhere. Either way, such a realm must exist as a function of the mind existing by transcendental reasoning. From all this, one important realization is that the mind has unique properties in virtue of it not being a material object. Something observed by Thomas Carlyle in his 1829 Sign of the Times. For the plain truth, very plain, we think, is that minds are opposed to minds in quite a different way, and one man that has a higher wisdom, a hitherto unknown spiritual truth in him, is stronger not than 10 men that have it not, or than 10,000, but than all men that have it not, and stands among them with quite ethereal angelic power, as with a sword out of heaven's own armory, sky-tempered, which no buckler and no tower of brass will finally withstand. Compare this with Shakespeare's observation in his play Coriolanus, as the populace turned the Senate and the people of Rome into an angry mob to drive out Coriolanus. We have in the mouth of Cominius this statement, quote, "But now 'tis odds beyond arithmetic, and manhood is called foolery when it stands against the falling fabric," close quote. So we see here that the kind of relationship of bodies, a bigger, stronger body is going to overcome a weaker body, and more men could theoretically more easily overcome one man, is seen here with Shakespeare, describing the plight and situation that Coriolanus is in. But not so with minds, with Carlyle. Part of the reason, though, of course, I don't know if Carlyle goes into like deep metaphysics here, but it's because the mind doesn't relate to the physical in the same way that other physical objects relate to other physical objects, which we will get to a little bit later. We see here that physical objects can easily be treated arithmetically and geometrically in an intuitive way. More men on the battlefield, in theory, gives one a superior edge. Yet coupled with the moral element that is described by both Clausewitz and Carlyle, we see this is not necessarily so. So, for example, you might have the same number of men on both sides with roughly the same level of training, but if one were to have a higher level of moral awareness, or not moral awareness, moral awareness, elan or spirit, then they would be more successful. And that's not something that can be really measured or quantified. In fact, Clausewitz says that it can't. He calls it the X factor. And it's this lack of ability to quantify it that makes it not material, because by definition, a material thing can be quantified and measured in precisely the ways in which the scientific method says that it can. This can partially be seen in the old scientific sense of observation, in this case of history, which Bertrand Russell holds as a body of truths that science builds upon before one proceeds with an experiment. Individuals, poets, philosophers, prophets, and saints have changed the course of history as a single individual with power far outweighing their, in many cases, rather diminutive stature. Again, if you just looked at them physically, you might not see them as having, might not expect them to have the influence in history in their own day that they actually do. If we observe the differences between minds and bodies, we realize that in the, let us call it hyperdimension, which contains mind, where minds exist in virtue of their constituent nature, we see that distance is a meaningless concept. Distance is a relation between two physical objects in space, and one must expend energy to cross that distance. And that can be measured. Not only the distance, but work, which is the product of force and distance. All of this can be measured in a way that you can't really measure how the mind affects your body or other objects. Yet a mind lacks spatial dimension, as stated above, and there exists in a way that transcends physical distance and relates to other minds in a way that is normally mediated through some physical process, though direct communication is theoretically possible. When thought gives rise to thought in a single mind, no distance is crossed. For example, more on this later, if one were to telepathically communicate with another mind, you could in there communicate with anyone in the world rather than using some material form of communication, such as speech, text, or telecommunications. In the world of the paranormal and psychic, we have two concepts to begin to follow from this: telekinesis, or moving physical objects with thought, and telepathy, communicating from mind to mind directly without the medium of some material communication system, whether organic to the human with speech or something synthetic like books or radio, or which is a form of early telecommunications. The latter probability was the basis for Asimov's second foundation of psychologists, i.e. the mentalists. Many of us have heard from such paranormal aficionados that most of humanity has latent telekinetic and telepathic powers. Asimov even says this in his Foundation series. The second Foundation intentionally cultivates these powers. How do we know this is true? Let us look at a man. Let us call him Hari Seldon. If Hari Seldon picks up a cup of coffee and drinks it, the command to pick up the cup of coffee to drink with the result of his own mind making a conscious decision to instruct his arm and hand to lift up the cup to his lips to drink comes directly from his mind. This is telekinesis. The mind is directly causing a physical result. Hari can do this naturally because he is so constituted that he is able to interface with his body in this way. Or I should say his mind is able to interface with his body in this way. He needs no training. If we look at physical objects in the world around us and even other people's bodies, it is not inconceivable that such a power, if cultivated, could extend beyond one's own body and apply to these external physical objects. And again, you have to admit that's at least conceivable since we know it exists in an individual who's acting, at least acting with intent. For example, one could act automatically. For example, your heartbeat, you're not actively thinking about it. It's sort of just a background automated process, just like digestion. One might also act spontaneously. For example, you can imagine a physician who has that little tiny hammer and hits you below the knee and your leg kicks up. It's an externally stimulated automatic response. So, of course, it's the physician's mind that's at work, but not yours. But still, it's not your mind. But if you make a conscious decision towards some goal, that's what would happen. One could speculate that the greater the mind and the greater the mental focus of said mind on a given object would be of great assistance in achieving this effect. For example, this power might even exist accidentally in others. Poltergeist activity is when, quote, spirits, unquote, or demons, quote unquote, throw objects around in a room to scare people. One possible explanation for poltergeist activity would be that a sensitive individual with great mental powers coupled with a lack of training and an excitable nature might produce an effect that is known as resistentialism. Resistentialism is the belief that some objects can have malicious intent even if they are inanimate. I was first introduced to this idea by M.R. James in his The Malice of Inanimate Objects. I am sure many of us have had this experience to a greater or lesser degree. Something just doesn't work right, or you trip over something, or you hit something, and it's like, well, how did that get there? It's not just, why was it right there to hurt me, right? For example, if Hari Seldon were very stressed and lacking in composure, his mental power might spaz out and cause things to fall, or another mind focusing on him with ill intent might do the same. So the simulated the objects moving around, which were at one point, I'm not saying that poltergeists can't be demons or spirits. I'm just saying that before you go to that level, you might want to consider something a little more mundane, which would also explain the phenomena. Let's see. Why telekinesis is not more common is for the same reason most people are not physicians, pilots, special forces, or theoretical physicists. It takes a lot of training to do this. If nobody is putting the money out for such training, as I do in the aforementioned cases, we would expect to see an undersupply of individuals with this power. This limiting factor is increased if we were to turn out to be the case that most minds are not the kind of minds that are able to produce this power to the degree needed for moving external objects. The other mental power, telepathy, is where without the use of any measurable physical medium such as speech, print, audiovisual, or telecommunications, one communicates directly with another mind. Let's break this down. In the normal process of ratiocination, one focuses on a thought and compares it to other thoughts, and this in turn, in a dialectical process, produces new thoughts. That this occurs in the mind of Hari Seldon is the result of the constituent nature of his mind. We can communicate ideas to others through physical mediums as described above. But if within a single mind, direct thought-to-thought transmission can occur without any external aid, why not speculate that this can extend to the minds of others, not just your own? Throughout history and literature, we have examples of siblings, lovers, family members, and friends having connections that, for lack of a better word, are telepathic. In the aforementioned cases, direct familiarity and empathetic understanding is already established in a very pronounced way. One thing to add here, too, is how If such a power could be cultivated, how would one get into other people's minds? In a sense, you might envision a backdoor switch, like say with a phone or telecommunications device, where like, I don't know, the government or the company that produced it has a backdoor switch to get into your phone, right? Something like that. Now, the question would be, though, I think it would come of two kinds. There would be one kind in which it's just what we might call, what's the word I'm looking for here, mundane, in the sense that, okay, if I walk up to you on the street and talk to you, I'm not violating, ethics to your space. I'm just talking to you. One might envision a purely mental conversation occurring that way. But if you have the power to bust into someone's mind like it's a locked door and then read everything inside, that could be seen as, snooping or invasion, which opens up a whole another can of worms. And of course, the mind control trope is based on this entirely, with one of the best early examples being the mule from Isaac Asimov's The Foundation. I am now moving into the realm of theology and metaphysics, more proper if we envision angels, demons, and God, who by nature are spirits, or in God's case, the spirit. How will they interact with the physical world? Necessarily, I think, via telepathy and telekinesis. God, possessing the omni qualities of knowledge and power, can, for example, communicate directly to a man through a dream, or part the Red Sea with just thought. Angels and demons, for example, would have such powers organically, though to a far lesser degree than God, as constituent part of their being. For example, as Hari Seldon is able to telekinetically control his body and telepathically generate thought in virtue of the organic union of body and mind, we can envision that angels and demons have such power over physical nature and other people's minds in virtue of their nature and how they relate to the physical world. That is, as they are beings of spirit first, without physical bodies, they have greater levels of innate power in that regard. God, being the creator of all things, necessarily is connected to spirits, minds, and the physical world in this way, rooted in the principle that a maker of a thing must possess power over it, even if that power is not fully understood. For example, someone who knows little to nothing of science can still see that a man who controls a power drill has power over it, even if he does not know exactly how to use it. And as we'll get into a little bit, as we've already stated, when we speculate on humans having such powers, they would have to work quite hard to get there, because they have a back door, so to speak, because humans have souls or minds as well as bodies. But I'll get into this later, because we have bodies, so that creates barriers to this in a way that these other beings don't, because they don't have bodies. Man's use of technology to gain control over the material world is procedural in nature. When one writes lines of code or updates best practices for some profession, such as firefighting or something, or instructs the user on how to control a forklift, the individual relates to the thing being operated in a formulaic way. By following the formula, you get the result. This power that takes training in order to manipulate physical technology is in part innate in man when he thinks and acts via a kind of spiritual technology. Adepts, angels, and God, to ever increasing degrees of power and control, possess a spiritual technology that operates in a way metaphorically analogous to, say, an earth mover or a line of code, i.e., if you manipulate it properly, it does the thing you want it to, as a sort of independent automatic process, because it does the work for them. For example, an adept might be able to create a personalized heads down display, or HUD, heads up display, in order to reduce the computation time of observing an interlocutor's facial expression, emotional states, and position to react nearly instantly in the appropriate fashion. For example, the powers of observation possessed by Sherlock Holmes could be construed as a literary example of such a spiritual technology, even, of course, if that wasn't necessarily the case of the author. My first steps down this road were in reading Asimov's Foundation trilogy when, if memory serves, when I was 14. I recently reread the trilogy, and for the first time, Foundation's Edge. The genius of Asimov and the concepts he is dealing with stick with me to this day. The powers of reasoning and observation are, of course, the result of my exposure to Sherlock Holmes when one summer in high school I read all the novels and short stories. The idea of a spiritual private investigator who both possesses powers of observation with a spiritual sense of empathy can be found in the works of William Hope Hodgson, Algernon Blackwood, and Arthur Machen, respectively. In the same order of presentation, they gave us the great occult detectives of Carnacki, John Silence, and Dyson. This work seems to have begun in the late 19th century and continues into the 20th. This insight more or less died out, but was revived by Asimov, albeit in a scientific and not supernatural way. If we accept the statement of Ernst Jünger that technology was the metaphysic of the 20th century, and that World War I was a religious war by the technocratic priesthood to destroy organic structures in both the victorious and vanquished nations, in the first case because they needed to create a technological system to win the war, and in the second case, the vanquished nations were destroyed, so their organic structures were destroyed as well. And in order to attempt to win the war, the Central Powers had to become more scientific, which ultimately they were not able to do to the sufficient degree to win. If one is not a part of a given religious, if one is not a part of, hold on a second. Here we go. Yeah, one was a religious war by technocratic priesthood to destroy organic structures in both victorious and vanquished nations, and one might begin to speculate that the bloodshed of this war stopped short a possible beginning of a spiritual or mental science. If one is not a part of any given religious tradition, the term mental science might be preferred, as Asimov did. But if one is part of a religious tradition, then spiritual science would be preferable. I think a similar case could be made for the fictional work of Hodgson, Blackwood, and Machen, though at present I am not aware of the work they were familiar with and popularizing, but they give the impression of such a body of work, in much the same way that Asimov did with psychology in his science fiction stories. If one were in the Middle Ages in, say, 1000 AD, and thought about a man flying, it would have taken nearly 1,000 years for powered flight to become a reality. Before the scientific discovery of powered flight could even occur, one had to imagine it. For example, the Legend of Icarus. In like fashion, these mental powers are currently, with the possible exception of saints, sages, and gurus, a latent potential. I have no idea how long it would take to develop such a science, but I think it has to be considered. One could envision a day in which mental phenomena are as well known and predictably used as material phenomena by our own current scientific methods. So to add to this, using the Kantian argument from Transcendental Nature, that we have a hyperdimension where minds exist. One could also envision, in the same way that we have like airflow or rivers or magnetic properties, there could be similar, quote, forces, unquote, in this hyperdimension where the mind exists and where other spiritual beings exist. And using those would just be like, harnessing the power of a river with a dam, or harnessing the power of the wind with a windmill. And so we could basically divide this into like three basic concepts. One would be cultivating your own mental powers, capacities you already have that are latent. Two, trying to manipulate these spiritual flows of energy. I mean, you can think of like the Chinese who speak of qi, or the Indian Hindu tradition with their ideas of the chakras as a kind of biological circuitry. And then, of course, you could actually consult other intelligent agents, which, from a Christian tradition is generally discouraged because that's often consulting demons, though not necessarily. Usually what would happen is the angels or God comes to you, rather than the other way around. That's something C.S. Lewis talks about, for example, in the introduction, in the opening parts of The Silver Chair, where Eustace and Jill are trying to get back to Narnia, and they think about possibly using a summoning spell, and they're like, yeah, probably would not be what would make Aslan happy. So they're not going to do that. Let's see. The main reason why such a theory is so far unfeasible, or at least difficult to imagine, is man is an amphibian with both a mind and a body. If man's physical needs are not met, he dies. Throughout history, this was the primary goal of civilizations, how to meet these needs. This meant that in the past, only an elite few of either rich elites or saints who endured voluntary poverty had the time to experiment with this kind of science. With the modern superabundance, man's material needs by modern science are met, and more people can be liberated from the struggle to survive to think on such matters. At least in theory. And I think in some sense, in fact, as well, as we see the scientific establishment moving more and more towards what they might call a simulation theory of the universe. I know, for example, Elon Musk, who's not necessarily a scientist, but seems to support the idea that, there is this higher dimension, this hyperdimension, if you will. We need to think in terms here of training and best practices. In the same way that, say, a prize fighter or soldier or firefighter needs to undergo intense training, a mental adept would need to do so as well. In the latter case, though, the mental and psychological training would be more important than the physical, unlike the other cases just mentioned. If one could imagine a man who, through intense mental training, was able to live in and observe reality from a higher superposition, from the proposed hyperdimension, he would be able to sift through material phenomena to see what is needful and what is not. So if you can imagine, as you climb up the mountain, okay, so let's say you have a movie set, which is supposed to look like a storefront, and then you have an actual storefront. Well, how do you tell the difference? Well, if you're allowed access to the set, you can see that these are all facades. You can walk behind the facade and see that there's nothing there. Now, imagine material reality like that. And the only way to look behind the facade is to climb the mountain and look down. And then you can see what's behind or not behind the facade. And you could just avoid all sorts of difficulties that way. Okay. Imagine, okay, I did that. Yeah. He sees more than the man at the foot of the mountain. If through such training and conditioning, the majority of men in a society were to do this, a true revolution would take place. This would likely at first begin in a small way, much like the Philosophes of the 18th century in their cafes. In time, this could then become a new social model in which society is designed to encourage, facilitate, and produce men with such mental powers, i.e., the second foundation of Asimov. The goal here is, through conditioning, meditation, and mental instruction, to elevate one's conscious waking life into this higher hyperdimension, to look back down on the world of matter in which our bodies exist. One reason this might have taken so long to even get here is, for example, how long it took to get modern science, which only got started the earliest in the 16th century. Science then sought to get explanations that did not make direct appeals to the supernatural or mental, but this is becoming harder and harder to keep up. Furthermore, for this to occur, for example, a good example might be the fine-tuning argument that's been made by Christian apologists, which was convincing enough to convince some former skeptics to change their minds. Some other influential ones. For example, let's see. I can't think of his name now, but there was a prominent skeptic at one point who said, what's the difference between an invisible gardener and man who's not there? Well, after being exposed to the fine-tuning argument, he changed his mind. So there is some precedent for this. Furthermore, for this to occur on a large scale, we would need men to produce the material abundance to escape the trap of material provision. So it's, in all likelihood, for similar reasons, it took a while to develop scientific knowledge. It also took a while to develop this higher mental science. The other thing here as well is, in order to have science in the first place, you need a sufficiently wealthy civilization which can protect itself from barbarian invasion and allow people to work with their minds instead of their hands. So, as I've stated elsewhere in my videos on the sit nomads. And so, how much more so would that be the case with a mental science, at least until it's developed? To summarize, I argue that minds are different than bodies in key ways. These ways indicate that the mind is not the same sort of stuff that bodies are. This entails another dimension of existence. This also opens the possibility of ideas that people are not fully aware of. Man has latent telekinetic and telepathic powers based on the use of his own mind to move his body and to think. It is therefore conceivable that he could project those powers outward with training and dedication. A mental science, like the material science, needs stories and cultural artifacts to seed people's minds with the notion in order to drive a more rigorous conception of science. And again, this is just a proof of concept, an idea. Obviously, we have authors, science popularizers who flirted with this idea and have made more or less convincing cases. But the more I think about it, the more I think that a convincing case can and should be made. this is not to be taken as a finalized statement, but just a what's the word to encourage future discussion and future engagement, so that something more could be developed. So that's all I have for tonight. And there's a lot here, so I think 30 minutes is going to be fine for most people. You might have to listen to it twice. Now let's check out the chat. We have Record Deepness, GF, Corbin, one Simicoid, hello. Corbin, Mass Creation Broadcast, hello. All right, we have a super chat. RA for 5, looks like pounds. Thank you very much. Interesting video, Todd. Thanks. Merry Christmas from England, by the way. Well, thank you for your donation. Merry Christmas to you, too. Record Deepness. So World War I could be modeled as almost a reverse Butlerian jihad, where the nascent technological civilization roots out the human factors which could be an obstacle alternative. That's a quote. That's from Record Deepness. Absolutely. That's exactly what I'm saying. GF, Jonathan Pajot, focus slots attention to may be useful in this discussion. Well, unfortunately, I'm not familiar with that distinction that Jonathan Pajot makes, but sure, could be. Corbin, Anglo, friends. Let's see. Is there anything else that's directly relevant to this? Well, I think what got me started thinking about this, I guess we're just going to go stream of consciousness right now, is the idea that once you kind of understand, the woo-woo ideas, and at the time, if you read Blackwood and Machen and Hodgson, they're like, yeah, there's a lot of cranks and crackpots. So like the fortune tellers, the street vendor psychics, and they're like, we're getting it at both ends. We're getting it from the scientific materialism from the top, and we're getting it from these crackpots at the bottom, which make us look bad. And so they are telling a story that makes this look plausible, where you engage with this phenomena and deal with it rationally. So I'm like, okay, this is interesting. And it's not what you would expect, like, the Satanism. In fact, that comes up. They're like, this isn't Satanism. This is just, that's a misconstruing of what we're doing. And that's part of what they view as the competitors. So, and then also, if you look at like pre-modern societies where people believed God or the gods spoke to them in dreams, or they had visions, that would be a pre-scientific way of describing this. So, for example, if you had a vision, or let's say you were communicated to in a dream, how is that different than telepathy? It might be the case that because you're in a dream, you're sleeping, your conscious mind is less willing to reject what you're being told. And you might also be more susceptible to receiving the message in the first place, which is why dreams would be considered so important. And I'm like, okay, I mean, yeah, that would be a pretty scientific way of saying that. And most people throughout history believed it. So the question is, okay, why did we stop believing it? Well, in part because of this new material science, which tried to edge it all out. But we're beginning to realize that it can't. There's chinks, more and more holes are appearing in the edifice. And so, yeah, that becomes more and more challenging. Plus a certain rigorous philosophical foundation for these kinds of things. Again, I've outlined earlier, as I said earlier in the essay, I outlined elsewhere in a video of mine, creates a new framework in which to look at these things. So I would say, yeah, these are all just various inputs that get us to think about it differently. Now, in one sense, you wouldn't necessarily, quote, measure, unquote, the thing like you would, like, say, the distance from point A to point B and, like, say, geometry or topography. But you could still create predictable environments in which to experiment with these kinds of phenomena, which would fall into the second definition of science, that of test and control experiments. I mean, here's the other thing too, right? There's this weird bifurcation here in the sense that the official scientific establishment does not, well, it for the longest time said this was impossible. Yet, the deep state, the CIA, funded MK Ultra and other sorts of mental phenomena, psychic activity. Now, why would they do that? Because they believed there was a real possibility there. That's why they did it. The government isn't just going to throw money at something like that if they don't think it's going to give them some edge, in this case against the Soviets. And so, yeah, I think that's really interesting that when you actually have to try to achieve practical real-world results, the U.S. government will fund it, which I think indicates that universities aren't interested in real-world practical results because they'll just believe in this materialist fantasy as long as possible, but the U.S. government won't. And a good video on that would be there was a video by What If Alt Hist on the CIA experiments, so which is interesting as well. So I think that also too, MK Ultra was what it's a whole bunch of independent vectors were coming into this, and it's like, okay, well, why is it being suppressed? Oh, well, it could be a developing phenomenon, right? So as it develops, it has to push against an already entrenched system. And then furthermore, when there was like live competition in the late 19th century between the two, and the material science won, it won by just blowing things up. It just built poison gas and artillery shells and mass production and just and one of the roundtables I had with Keith and Florian, and when we saw Alexei, I mentioned enemy might have caused World War I. The idea that people have this pent up psychological tension, which if you just kind of like destroy people psychically enough, things like shell shock and PTSD, they just won't be able to do this anymore. There's just nobody home. They're gone. Bye-bye. Of course, Hodgson himself died in the First World War. So couple that with actual thinkers of this dying, and it's like, okay, yeah, it's a big setback. It's a big setback. Record deepness governments would also be willing to hide information like this, given how explosive the result could be. They wouldn't be a way to monopolize, regulate mental activity. Bingo, that's right. And unlike, say, material science, which, if we go back to the distinction between Mordor magic and elf magic, that is external to you, right? So there's high capital costs. There's barriers to entry. You can't. Very few people can gain access to those technologies. Whereas it might be, in principle, very difficult to cultivate these spiritual technologies, if you will, mental technologies. You could, in theory, do it with enough time by yourself without any capital whatsoever. So in that regard, or very little capital, it would just completely blow the whole thing apart. And if you want to hold together a society that is highly capitalized, which privileges those people that have the capital, then yeah, you surely would not want this to become mainstream, and you do whatever you could to stop it. Because as soon as you do, people can just start, they don't need you anymore. And they can push back on you in ways you can't even foresee, right? I mean, in Starship Troopers, both the book and I think the film, which I did not watch, and History of More Philosophy, Zinn says, why do you have a knife? Why do you have hand-to-hand combat training? So you can pin a guy's hand to the wall so he can't push the nuclear launch codes or missile launch codes or whatever. And I'm like, right, but what's even better than, you still have to take action and move. But like as Asimov is telling us, well, what if you just did it with your thought? It'd be just as effective, almost impossible to trace, and takes much less energy. You don't have to get up in his face and stab him. Well, maybe not less energy. I guess it depends on how much it takes to focus. But yeah, it opens up a lot of possibilities. And so I think there would be people that would not want this to become more evident. And so, yeah, that's my thoughts for the end of the year, guys. Again, there may or may not be a end of the year hangout stream with people. I guess I need to see how popular that might be. But again, everyone, thanks for tuning in. Thanks for being here this year. Look forward to a lot of new exciting content next year. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.